kind of an informal series of our people of the book, wrote books and their authors. Tonight we're going to do something from Rabbi Malbim. And the talk tonight is entitled "The Word's the Thing." I want to begin with a metaphor before we talk about tonight's author and his oeuvre. You know, this series, we've done quite a few authors by now because we're already on the second additional week after the third series of the 19th century. Try to think of it as an architecture appreciation class or series where you've been taken around Manhattan and you've been shown the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building and the Guggenheim Museum and all, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright and the age of Gewalt, having a senior moment. Art Deco, you know, the great Art Deco building and so on and so forth, and you're being asked to compare and contrast them. And then, as a little change of pace, we go on a tour of Home Depot or Lowe's Home Center. And we examine different texture of bricks and different grades of steel and different kinds of sheetrock and so on and so forth. We're not looking at the forest anymore. We're looking at the component trees. But everyone knows the greatest design, the greatest architecture cannot be ignorant of its own component parts. And in the grandest expressions of art, be it architecture, be it painting, whatever it is, right, there becomes like a unity between style and substance, between ztz'l and steak. So, even though I could have translated a passage from the Malbim's commentary on Chumash, on other books of the biblical canon, which he wrote very extensively on, one of the things I think makes this author unique is that he is a wordsmith. Now, it really depends on your turn of personality. Some people will consider his style in the passage that I've chosen to translate tonight to be kind of pedantic, kind of picayune, kind of very, very picky. I don't. Okay? Maybe it has something to do with my training. But certainly, those of us who've been fortunate enough, and I do consider it a very blessed good fortune, to have gotten an advanced yeshiva education, know that at least when examining a Talmudic text or commentaries on the Talmudic text, tremendous attention is paid to words, to turns of phrases, to sequence of words, to nuances of the difference between apparent synonyms, and so on. And what the Malbim does is that he takes it to a biblical level, if you will. Now, before I hand out on the Malbim, I want to say a few things about language in general, and a slight biographical sketch, although I'm not really super familiar with the Malbim's biography. But you know, an academic historian, you know, looks for materialistic or socioeconomic or political factors when doing biographies of great men and says, well, they were a product of their times. You know, I prefer to think of it in more divine providential terms, that Hashem, so to speak, knows. It's a famous epigram of the Talmud. God saw that the truly righteous are few and far between, and therefore He scattered them in each and every generation. And to me, an undercurrent of that teaching of the sages is that we get the leadership we need when we need it. It's not so much that they're a product of their times as that they are shakers and movers and producers of their times. Or at least that the divine hand that guides history knows which tzaddik and which minds, which what I would call shasha and neshama, soul roots are most appropriate for the interpretation of that Torah for that era. So we'll get to the historical factors about why I think perhaps the Malbim developed this ultra attention to the detail of words in his approach to biblical commentary in a moment. But first, a word in general about words. Okay. Almost everyone here, I'm assuming, has read 1984. And one of the major themes of 1984 that George Orwell is trying to get across is how totalitarian systems exercise mind control through lexicon control. You take control of a language, you take control of a people's dictionary, and that's one of the most effective ways of controlling them. And one of the techniques in his fictional totalitarian state that they use is to develop a very spare, a very reduced, a very impoverished kind of language. Okay? Instead of having 3 words, good, better, best, you have good, plus good, and double plus good. All right? You don't even have a different word to connote something better than good. And the idea being that by restricting and by reducing, as it were, the variety and the diversity of people's language, you also rob them of their critical faculties, of their ability to discern slight differences rather than gross differences. This is one of Orwell's big themes. I want to read you a passage or two from an essay that George Orwell wrote in 1946. Okay, Politics in the English Language. Most people who bother the matter at all would admit that the English language is in a bad way. Now, this was way before Ebonics, and studies showing that college seniors today have the English language skills of 7th graders in the 50s. Right? He was writing this in 1946. Even then, it was in a bad way. But it is generally assumed that we cannot, by conscious action, do anything about it. Our civilization is decadent, and our language, so the argument runs, must inevitably share in the general collapse. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism, like preferring candles to electric light or hansom cabs to aeroplanes. Underneath this lies the half-conscious belief that the language is a natural growth and not an instrument which we shape for our own purposes. Okay? And he goes on, the idea being, the argument that he's going to make is, you can perfect the language, you can bring quality to a language, and a lot of it is about attention to detail and sticking to the rules, the pre-established rules of a language. And then he quotes some academic types, that are just writing this, obtuse, impenetrable, opaque prose, just showing how terrible it is. This is just too funny. It's not even our living Torah, from Rabbi Kaplan. He has a lot of categories over here. Dying metaphors. I think what we call a hackneyed, overused phrase. Operators of verbal false limbs, pretentious diction, meaningless words.
Think of television stuff today.
Yeah, a lot of,
change. Everything is changed.
Double speak. Here is a well-known verse from Ecclesiastes. Okay, now this is the King James Version. This is not how Rabbi Kaplan would have rendered it. But listen to this. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Here it is in modern English. You ready for this? Hold on to your seats. Objective consideration of contemporary phenomena compels the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. Now, which of those two versions do you like better? I'll take King Solomon's, okay? All right, I'm trying to give a more broad-based appeal over here to this class, so we can go outside the Torah a little bit and see the Chachamim that, sage like brilliant people understood that language can be debased. It doesn't have to be debased through pidgin usage, like I said before, like by Ebonics. This is very dense, academic type prose, right? But it's dead, it's lifeless, it's meaningless, right? That's the first thing. More to the point, I wish I had brought this book. I recently got an anthology of the works of Franz Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig, was an early 20th century Baal Teshuvah. He was a person who was raised as a secular Jew, and he was actually a Hegelian philosopher, and he was, I don't know his whole biography, but he was about 2 inches away from converting to Christianity. And he became a Torah observant Jew later in his life, and he wrote books of Jewish philosophy. At any rate, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting Franz Rosenzweig exactly. But he said the following, approximately. He said, neither the naked truth nor the naked untruth can survive. They must be clothed to warm themselves. But the problem lies in this, that when clothed, they are sometimes indistinguishable from one another. That was his metaphor. Okay? If we look at words as the clothing for pure cognition, for the abstractions in our mind, right? Just as a naked body is not presentable in public, right? We are not telepathic. We cannot communicate directly through our minds. If we want to get into the public forum, that's where language comes into play. You've got to clothe our thoughts, all right? The problem is, as he said, when you have ill-fitting clothes, you have baggy, imprecise clothes, especially, it's very possible for truth and falsehood to look the same. Okay, now a little bit of the Malbim's biography. And although we're studying his, I don't even know what to call, philological works, lexicographic works tonight, the Ram was a great Talmudist. The Malbim, was a great Talmudist. He was, I'm a little bit prejudiced, but I don't think you get this kind of precision of thinking without excelling at Talmud study. He was a great Talmudist. He was a great halachist. He wrote works. He wrote glosses on the Shulchan Aruch. He dabbled in Jewish philosophy as well. He wrote a work, a super commentary on Maimonides' dogma, his 13 principles of faith. Was the 13th principle of faith or Hilchos Deis? I'm not sure. But at any rate, he was what I would call, for want of a better word, a really interdisciplinary Talmud Chacham. He wasn't a specialist who knew more and more about less and less. He had a very, not just a profound knowledge, very, very broad-based encyclopedic knowledge, as we're going to see, even if we limit it to biblical scholarship, we're going to see the absolute encyclopedic sweep of the man's mind. He lived in an era when the Haskalah, the movement of Jewish enlightenment, and the Jewish reform were really working up a head of steam. Okay? As a matter of fact, he was invited to the first Congress of the Reform Rabbinate. What town was it? I don't know, I have it written down somewhere. I don't remember exactly. And again, if time allows, at the end of the class, I'll share some tidbits, from his biography of some run-ins that he had with the various members of the Enlightenment and the Reform. Suffice to say, he was an Orthodox rabbi. Many of his works, if not directly polemical, in other words, he wasn't getting into argumentation with this new, what he considered to be a heretical branch of Judaism, but the object of his works was to belie some of the slander, if you will, that the Reform and the Haskalah had raised against traditional Torah commentaries and the Talmud and the Bible itself. And in particular, a darling pet cause, if you will, of the early Reform of the Haskalah was something called, I shouldn't even mention it, something called documentary hypothesis. Basically, it's a theory that the Torah itself, the Bible itself, forget about the Talmud, forget about the Medrash, Bible itself is not of divine authorship, it's not divinely inspired, it's a totally human work. And this is the cornerstone of much of biblical criticism, a whole scholastic academic field. And the basic idea was it's a patchwork, it's a hodgepodge put together in different eras by different groups or individual authors with differing agendas and social cultural contexts and so on and so forth. And one of the main stock and trades of those who promote this theory of the documentary hypothesis is to look for irregularities in words, poetic, what we would call in the prophets, poetic redundancies, right? It's like a later author was just embellishing it, was trying to make it better, so he repeated the metaphor a second time or a third time, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, rather than shout, from the ramparts that, these are heretics and they're undermining the foundations of Torah and so on and so forth, he created a literature to show that this is nonsense. That close attention to the words of the Torah can lead to no other conclusion other than divine authorship. Okay, so at this point, I'm ready to do the handout, and you can look it over for a moment, and then we'll have you read. Just take one and pass it along. Okay, unfortunately, Tom did not allow. I tell you, we're getting into the point in this series where there's not a lot of English translations, and yours truly has to hammer away with dictation with Mrs. Mayo, and I don't always have as long or as diverse a handout as I'd always like to. So I may have to translate from the Hebrew as we go. Okay. I have two passages here from the Malbim's foreword to his commentary on the biblical book of Isaiah, of Yeshayahu Hanavi. Okay. Mrs. Young, you haven't been with us for a long time. You want to do the first reading here tonight?
We do not find either the metaphors of the prophets or in their explanations, whether stated once or apparently repetitious nouns or verbs placed in the text arbitrarily without a specific intent, such that all nouns, verbs, or any type of word from which the fabric of prophetic rhetoric is woven must appear in the prophetic saying in which they do, in fact, appear.
Stop. Just with the emphasis I want with italics. Must appear in the prophetic saying in which they do, in fact, appear. In other words, he's trying to say it's an imperative. The text, the way it is literally chiseled in stone. It had to be expressed and transmitted through the generations the way it was. Go ahead, read on.
It would have been impossible for the divine interlocutor and envoy, that is the prophet, to have substituted any other words instead. For each and every divine word and metaphor is weighed in the scales of wisdom and understanding. They are arranged and preserved, counted and recounted in a measure of supernal wisdom. Only it can speak in the inimitable way. Okay.
I should have capitalized it, meaning when you have an envoy, a prophet. Okay. Another thing, this I mentioned in other classes, and I think I got this from the Malbim, that there are two words in Hebrew that connote what we would call a prophet: a navi and a choseh. A navi is usually translated in English as a prophet. I know that it's a Greek word. I know the etymology of the word prophet. And a choseh is a seer, from seeing, right? Although most people, when they say the word prophet, they're thinking in their minds, the mental image they conjure up it's a vision thing, right? But really in Hebrew, the word navi is more about being a great orator, or at least being a spokesperson, an envoy, and a diplomat. Right? When Moshe Rabbeinu wants to resist his mission as the preeminent prophet for the Jewish people, so he says, I got a speech impediment. I can't talk right. And God responds to him, Aaron achicha yiyeh neviyacha. Aaron, your brother, will be your navi, will be your prophet. What does that mean? He's going to foretell the future for you? No. It means he'll do the talking. You give him the message, and he'll be the one to be your actual spokesperson to power. Okay? So first and foremost, prophecy is about oratory. It's the greatest compliment, they used to say about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, he spoke like an Old Testament prophet. And that's my picture too. The great orators, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't want to be a prophet because he's got a speech impediment. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, Navi says, Nar anochi v'lo uchel daber. I can't speak properly, and so on. Okay, so what he's saying is, yes, they were spokespeople, and maybe their inflection and their delivery was like an Old Testament prophet, right? But their speechwriter was divine. And it's clear from their rhetoric, is the Malbim's assertion. At this point, he's only asserting it, right? It's clear from their rhetoric that, on the contrary, this can only have been divine. It's inimitable. This way of speaking, that every word is measured, that there's these little nuances of meaning, of inflections, of layered and multi-layered levels of meaning, that's something that a human author could not possibly have come up with. Okay? That's his assertion at this point. Okay? Okay, the next one, Ed.
In prophetic imagery, one will never find an empty shell, a soulless body, a garment, without one being clothed, rhetoric void of an exalted concept, a proverb wherein understanding does not dwell. For these are the words of the living God. All of them, without exception, have the living God in their midst. The breath of life in their nostrils, a spirit that is awesome, mighty, exalted, and awe-inspiring.
Okay. I don't know if the prophets never did poetic redundancy. Maybe the Malbim himself was indulging over here a little bit in poetic redundancy. But you can see he was obviously pretty passionate and pretty taken with his thesis when he wrote these words. Okay, the basic idea of this last passage that we're reading is that to fob off a literary irregularity in the Tanakh anywhere in the biblical canon, he says is impossible. He's making an assertion that every single word is measured, it's full of life, it's full of the divine spirit. Not every scholar is going to be able to ferret that out for you. It's one of the things that our sages teach us in Pirkei Avos. It says there are 7 signs of a wise person, and the opposite is true of a golem. Okay, we all know what a golem is. And the Yiddish, a golem means an idiot. Just golem, golem. And one of them is not to project a sense of infallibility and being a know-it-all oracle. All right, that's another level of meaning of the word pedant. A pedantic person is a person who has this condescending, air of I know it all and you know nothing. That's when we use pedant as an insult. That's what we mean. That's not how a chacham. That's not how a wise man should be. A wise man, the Mishnah Pirkei Avos says, "Al ma she'eino yodea, omer eini yodea." Something that he doesn't know, he says, "I don't know." Rashi several times in the commentary on Chumash says, "Eini yodea." I don't know what this means. All right? So it's not infallibility, but nevertheless, as much as a human being in the 19th century could divine things out, and again, his main objective was not just to reinvest the Torah that was beginning to lose its luster among the Jewish masses. Many people were buying into this heresy of documentary hypothesis, right? Not just to return the Torah to what it was, but also the oral tradition, the Talmud and the Medrash, to show how the two Torahs, if you will, the written Torah and the oral Torah, are inseparable from one another, how one flows out of the other, how if you know the real pshat, if you know the real meaning of words and nuance of words and sentence structure and grammar and all the rules, okay, the hermeneutics, as it's called, of the Talmud and the Medrash become the plain meaning of the text. That was his life's work. Later was taken up by the Torah Tamima as well. A little bit. A 20th century rabbinical author also went along these lines. Okay, now I want to do the part. Not everyone here is literate in Hebrew, so I'm going to have to read this last part. But now I want to read to you from a work called Ya'ir Ar. I didn't bring that down either. Should have brought down the original. Okay. Ya'ir Ar, I wrote here as a kind of thesaurus. I think it's a unique work because when I work in Microsoft Word, okay, and I hit Shift F7 and I get my thesaurus editing feature comes up on the side of my screen. Basically, it's giving me a list of 10, 15, 20 words, whatever it is. And I'm the one who just has to know, through my familiarity with the language, the context of the sentence that I'm trying to write, which word is most appropriate. Okay? Most of us, when there are many, many synonyms, have a hard time, we're left scratching our head and saying, well, really, what's the difference? How do I know which word is most appropriate? How do I know which word fits best? They sound so alike to me. Right? Basically what I'm trying to say is traditional thesauruses, excuse me, I'm also a kvad pav, a bit of a lisp. Thesaurus is one of my worst words. Okay? But traditional of those books that start with a th, right, are about comparing words. And with this work, Yair Ar, which the word means casting light, which to me is not too veiled an attack on the idea of enlightenment of his opponent. I'm the one casting the light. Yair Ar is the idea of not comparisons but contrasts. I'm going to give you 2, 3, sometimes 7 or 8 words that, as far as you can tell, they're totally interchangeable. They mean exactly the same thing. And I'm going to show you the little nuance of meaning, the precision that separates one word from the other. Okay? Which really, that's why, before citing one example here, I wanted you to see these passages from his forward to the book of Isaiah. That is his thesis. That is his assertion. Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, the component parts, the little bricks that we build the structure of the Torah out of, each word has its own individual meaning, and they're not interchangeable. What's the modern vernacular? They're not fungible. Okay? They had to be the way they are. Okay. Here's an example. Okay, he's talking about through 3 words. This is the 7th entry of the letter Gimel. It's an alphabetical arrangement, but it's not pure alphabetical arrangement because it depends which of the synonymous words he wants to start his entry with. Okay? The 3 words that he's dealing with over here are Gai, Am, and La'om. Okay, so first I have to disabuse some people sitting around the table of the first misconception. The word Gai that he's talking about over here is not the pejorative term when a Jew is speaking about a non-Jew. Oh, a Gai. Right? Oh, that's Gaiish. Oh, Gaiish a cup. That's a Yiddish idiom. He's talking about the biblical word Gai here, which Gai means a nation. It's really not a very pejorative term at all. All it means is a member of a nation, other than my own. That's really all a Jew means when he says the word Gai. Okay, at any rate. Gai, Am, Lu'um. Okay, there's an extra yud over there. I should have Hebrew spell checked it better. Gai, Am, and Lu'um, which Lu'um incidentally is very etymologically close to the Arabic Quranic Ummah. They always speak about the Islamic nation. Okay. Interchangeable. 3 words that are synonymous. To me, they were before I read this passage in the Malbim. If somebody had asked me what's the difference between these 3 words, I really have no idea. Okay? So here goes. Time did not allow for me to translate the part about La'om. But let's see the difference between Gai and Am. Okay, Gai equals Gai. Okay, I transliterated it before translating it. Nation. Is from the etymological root Gaveh, or Gvia, indicative of a body. Okay? We say in Yigdal, Adon Olam, V'im ruchi gviyasi, Hashem li v'lo yira. Right? Gviyasi, with my spirit, goes my body. A gviya means a body. Thus, the word means an aggregate of bodies. Okay, he's revealing to you the root meaning of the 3-letter root in Hebrew, Gai, Gimel, Vav, Yud. What does that mean? It means try to think of the Vav not as a vowel but as a consonant. Gviya, Gavei, a body. Okay? The idea, think of individual members of a nation, okay, as cells within one organism. If they're not disintegrated, if they're integrated, if they come, even in our modern idiom, we speak about the body politic. All right? The idea of coming together as one organism, that's what a nation is. A national identity rather than an individual identity. I mean, he's not saying any big eye-opening chidushim here yet. Hasn't said anything particularly new yet. Okay, it's insightful, but I think anyone who would stop to think about it, yeah, that's a reasonable etymology. It's a reasonable root for the word for nation. Okay. Thus, the word means an aggregate of bodies. We find, this is in Bereshis 10:5. Okay, you don't have to open the Living Torah because I've actually copied the translation of the Living Torah for you. Ish lil shono, l'mishbechosam, begoyehen, me'ela nifredu iye hagayim ba'artzosam. Okay, so this is his proof text. Once he's writing his lexicon or his commentary on Chumash, he isn't making any assertions anymore. He's proven it. He's not telling you to take this on faith. Okay? I say this is what the word means. How do you know this is what the word means? Well, let's go to the source. The source of biblical Hebrew is the Bible. Let's understand from context how the Bible uses it. How is the Bible defining this word itself? How is the Torah defining this word itself? Okay, just to give you context, this verse, this pasuk that we're citing over, that we're examining, is the end of the story of the Tower of Babel. Right? The origin of individual nations and individual languages. Right? Goes through some families of man, and then it says, Me'ela nifdu iya gamba tzayim ishul shalish mechaysav b'gayim. Okay, I'm sorry again. On my computer, I glitched it. The second line is supposed to be the first line. Me'ela nifdu iya gayim b'atzasam ishul shalish mechaysav b'gayim. The English reads, from these, the isolated nations branched out into their lands. Each had its own language for its family in its nations. This is repeated later in Bereshit 10:31. From here we learn that the gathering of people which defines a national identity is distinguished by 4 points. A land in which they settle and unite. Right? It says in this verse, it says the word ba'artzosam, in their lands. Right? So part of a national identity, part of a thing that lends cohesion, that takes a bunch of disparate individuals and makes them into a nation, is land. Okay? Nationalism based on land. Next, a common language in which they communicate. Ish lil shono. Each had its own language. Right? So part of national identity is, do we speak a common language? Remember that America, polyglot America, is a blip on history's screen. Okay? For most of human history, nations were monolithic in terms of their language. And if there were nations that had main languages being spoken of, more often than not, there was an apartheid, even if they didn't have that word at the time. There was the language of the ruling class and the language of some kind of an oppressed, servile, colonized nation that they were exploiting. Okay? But basically, the people in power all spoke the same language. Right? A common language which they could see a shared tribal family background, or what we would call today ethnicity. Right? It says lemishbechosam, for their families. What's the difference between an ethnicity and a family? Numbers. Okay? In the earlier generations of mankind, what might have been a 25-member clan or family, through natural exponential growth, population growth through the centuries, can become a nation. Okay? If you trace the ancestry, if there's no intermarriage, so to speak, you can trace the basic ethnic stock of certain nations to several small tribes. We Jews trace ourselves to 12 people, essentially. Right? 12 tribes of Israel. D. Through the social contract whereby they become one nation. Through particular manners and cultural mores, which they adopt after they unite. Okay? Now here I don't see a particular word in the pasuk that indicates this, but I think what he means to say is that when you have a family speaking the same language in the same land, that's already part of the social contract. There's an understanding among all the family members that, hey, we're going to stick together as a family, so to speak. We're going to live around here. And for most languages other than biblical Hebrew, all, as the Ramban says, famous essay in the Drush of Rosh Hashanah, all languages develop as kind of a social contract. They certainly evolve that way. It reaches a critical mass of people that agree, okay, we're going to start adopting this word, we're going to start using this word. I never heard the word fungible 20 years ago. Now a lot of people use it. I never heard the word chutzpah used in mainstream English. Now you hear it all the time. Right? I mean, you really can't compare the modern era with mass media, with telecommunications. But all throughout human history, language was developed. It's also part of the social contract. Enough people decided, understood one another, a word took on a new meaning, and new words were introduced, and so on. So all of that together, it really encompasses more. Law and custom and systems of government, technology even. Okay, all of that is contained in the word guy. Now he's contrasting that with the word am. Okay? What's the difference between a guy and an am? Okay? Whereas the word am, okay, I transliterated it here, refers to their relationship to the body that governs them. Okay? Whether that's one single individual, aka a king or a dictator, or a democratic form of government, or anything in between, that's what an am is. Okay? An am is not, in other words, is already a relationship. It's not so much the organism itself, the people themselves who have united and have integrated to form a nation. It's how that nation relates to its government. That's what an am is. This governmental body will make them into a united, incorporated nation, and will lead them as the soul, mind, controls and governs the integrated limbs of the body. In other words, okay, just to give it a very gross and base metaphor, just to kind of understand, what he's talking about. Okay, think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein monster. Okay, you've got this grave robber, who's getting a bunch of rotting limbs, of disintegrating limbs, from the graveyard. All right, and then through some kind of science fiction, right, he stitches them together. Right? The stitching together of the right arm and the left arm and the skull and the throat and the legs and the torso, the trunk of the Frankenstein monster, okay? Those various acts of surgical stitching, if you will, some of them are represented by language, and some of them are represented by law, and some of them are represented by ethnicity, okay? Those are the glue, those are the connective tissue, okay, that put this thing together. It's now an integrated being. It's not disintegrated, it's integrated. There's here a total that's greater than the sum of its parts. But it's still dead. It's still lifeless. All right? What gets the Frankenstein monster off the operating table and lumbering around? Yeah? In his metaphor, in his model, that's what governments are. Right? So when you give the Frankenstein monster the name Frankenstein, the name of its creator, the name of the thing that gave it life and direction, right? That's relating, that correlates to the Hebrew word am. Yeah, you're an integrated being, but who controls you? Who directs you? What informs all of this? Your ethnicity and your language and your mores and your values. What's leading you? What's directing you? And how do you relate to that which directs you? That's an am. This word is truly a synonym for the word mamlacha. Okay, there's also a Hebrew word, mamlacha. Okay? Kingdom. The nuance of difference being that the word mamlacha emphasizes the relationship with the king, whereas am implies the nation's subservience to the king. Okay, I can just tell you that there's a famous Kabbalistic epigram that says, "Ef shel melech below am." You can't be a king without a nation. That's how the Jewish mystics explain why Rosh Hashanah is a day of God's kingdom. Because until Adam was created, okay, it's very nice, you can put a crown on your head, but if you're not lording it over anyone, you're not a king. All right? So until there was Adam, until there was somebody to lead and to govern, so to speak, God wasn't king yet. He wasn't king from day 1 of creation, he was only king from day 6 of creation, which is the anniversary of Rosh Hashanah. Okay? So again, he's not wearing his Kabbalistic knowledge on his sleeve over here, but to me it's clear that's what he's alluding to. So whereas am implies the national subservience to the king. This is why am always appears in the possessive form. Ami, amcha, amo. Okay, for those of you who don't know Hebrew, ami means my nation. Amcha means your nation. Amo means his nation. Third person. And in the adjacent form. Adjacent form means shall the nation of. Right? And then fill in a blank. Right? Okay, so in other words, a nation is something possessed by a governing entity, either a council, a Congress, or a king, or one individual. That's what an am is. Okay, you got the nuance of what he's delineating here between Guy and am? Okay. Now, just to show you both the man's encyclopedic scholarship, if the way he uses these proof texts, it wasn't good enough, and his integrity, okay, he's going to raise a question on himself, on this thesis. This is not the case, well, he'll do that in a second, at the end of this paragraph. This is not the case with the word guy. Okay? Simple. Okay? He's stating as a fact. Guy is not possessive. Guy does not imply how the nation relates to its governing body or to its king. For a nation relates to its master through the aspect of his government, not through the aspect of their aggregate unity. There is no contradiction to this distinction from what we find in Tehillim 106. So in other words, he brought proof texts. He's proving his thesis of what the word guy means, right? And how it's distinguished from the word am. He brought proof texts for that as well. He's saying, but maybe you want to bring a disproof text. He's going to bring down two texts where the word guy, which he just said is never used possessively, is used possessively. So how does that work? Okay, there's no contradiction to this distinction. What we find, distinction means distinction from the word between the word guy and am. From what we find in Tehillim 106, verse 5, Lismoach besimchas gayecha, to rejoice with the joy of your nation. Okay, it should have said amecha, according to his thesis. Or in Tzfanya, v'yesa guy. Gayi, it's actually Gayi. I didn't have the Nakudos in Hebrew printed out, but there's a chirik, there's a dot under the yud in that word. The Yesa Gayi Yinchalum, and the remnant of my nation shall inherit them. So this seems to be a contradiction to what he said before. Only Am can be possessive. It can be in the possessive form, not Gai. So what's going on over here? So he explains it as follows. You notice how even in my English translation here, I uppercased the word your nation in the first verse from Tehillim, and my nation in the second verse from Tzfanya. Okay. Why is that? That's a literary convention that we're talking about God. Any pronoun that refers to God, you capitalize the word. Right? In context, in both of those verses, it's clear that the possessor that we're talking about over here is God. L'smag b'simchas goyecha is not Reuven speaking to Shimon, it's King David speaking to God. Okay, it's your guy, uppercase, he's talking to God. Okay, v'yesa gayi yinchalum, clearly he's speaking through the prophet. It's God doing the speaking. The prophet is only the spokesman. All right, so God is saying, "My nation." That's why the uppercase am. So now listen to what he says. For we can attribute possessiveness to him in the very construct of his creations without regard to his governance over them. Okay, what that means is as follows. Maybe God the king, so to speak, I wouldn't say this if the sages of the Talmud didn't say it, maybe God the king does not exist until the sixth day of creation. But God the creator, his identity as creator is true from the moment he said, let there be light. As long as there is something created, okay? When Rembrandt paints a painting, or Picasso paints a painting, or Jackson Pollock paints a painting, okay? It belongs to him. Okay? In the lifetime of the artist, if they sell it at Sotheby's, or they sell it at auction, okay, they start, working out a provenance, he sold it to him, and he sold it to him, right? Every good painting has a yichus brief, we would call it in Yiddish, as a genealogy chart, they call it a provenance, right? But the original sale, the original property rights, go to the artist. Now why is that? Because he went down to the art supply store, and he bought the canvas, and he bought the oil, or he bought the acrylic for the painting? Maybe. But that's not really the point. The real point is, it's his creation. I made it, it belongs to me. Yeah? That's what we're saying. You haven't disproven my thesis yet, because if you'll show me a temporal king or a temporal government anywhere in the Bible, bring me any text in the Bible that when referring to the Moabites, right, or the Edomites, or the Persians as a nation, relating to their king, the Greeks relating to their senate, right, to the governing body, using the word guy, then you've disproven my theory. Then it's got to be on. But when you're talking about God, okay, God can own a nation not because he governs them, because he made them. You're one of my artistic creations. That's how the possessive is proper, even by the word God. Okay, so what I'm trying to show you over here is this is a man, who knew all the books of the Bible verbatim by heart. He was not doing this with a database, with a word processor, with a search for similar words. Okay, this is all up here in the Naga. Okay, and the integrity of the scholarship. Okay, most of the readers of this work, all right, could go through several lifetimes before they would even chance upon the verses in Tehillim or in Svanya that contradict his dictionary entry for these two words. And even if they would, to remember it, to put it together with what some of the Malbim wrote, right? So it was very rigorous. The scholarship was very rigorous here. Okay. What time is it now? 9:01. Okay. I started a little late, so I'm going to give myself the luxury of going a little bit late. I'm going to read a little bit more from something called Ayelas HaShachar, which is the Malbim's introduction to his commentary on the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus. Okay, I'm going to give you a running translation over here. Actually, I'll give you a synopsis. Basically, what he says over here is what he does with individual words and the meaning of individual words in this work, Ayelas HaShachar, in this rather lengthy forward. 613 rules. Just like there are 613 mitzvahs, he developed 613 rules of grammar, of spelling, of syntax, of sentence structure. Exactly. Okay. Not my cup of tea. Too much for me. Okay. But 613 individual words, and again, the idea is. Let me see if I can. In this commentary, I've developed a new approach, which has its roots in sanctity, to explain the words of the sages and their riddles, the words of our rabbis in their Masorah, in their reception of the oral Torah, based upon the foundations, the fundamentals of our language, and according to the rules of diction and pronunciation, in new and wondrous ways. Here I have shown and clarified that our Chazal, our sages of our Talmud and Medrash, possessed veritable treasure troves of wisdom and of understanding. They had tremendous rules and foundations and fundamentals in the ways of grammar, in the etymology of words, in the pronunciation of the words, many of which were hidden and concealed from all subsequent scholars who came after the Talmud. And that is why their footsteps were concealed and their ways were not known. I have shown with reliable proofs, and this is to me the most fundamental, the most important line of this whole forward, of this whole preface. Ki hadrush hu apshat. The hermeneutics, the quote-unquote, the man-made Torah. The rabbis conjured out of their own limited human minds. No, that's the pshat. That's the plain meaning of the text. Okay, and again, I'm not on the level of the Malbim scholarship. You're not on the level of the Malbim scholarship. What I understand, his methodology, his approach, his tactic, throughout this work is, it's like a game of Jeopardy. Okay? You start with the answer. If this is the answer, what must the question have been? Okay? If this is the halacha that our sages developed out of this text, if this is the agada, the medrash, the homiletic lesson, the moral ethical lesson, okay? How did they get from point A to point B? Starting with point B, starting with the oral Torah, starting with the medrash, and starting with the halacha that's developed in the oral Torah, and the medrash or the Gemara, whether it's again the homiletic part of the Torah or the legal part of the Torah of the Talmud, will present you with a drush. It'll say, well, you've got this word, you've got the comparison of these two texts, and that's how we developed this idea. And at first glance, it seems like mumbo jumbo. How they get from A to B. But if you begin with 613 rules, of the language and of the grammar and of the syntax, it becomes a little clearer. You're able to trace back from the answer, not so much to the question, but from the resultant teaching to how it's being taught, how it's being read into the words. I wouldn't even call it derived from the words, read into the words. And that is, like I said, I didn't translate a passage of his commentary on the Bible. I wanted to get a little bit more fundamental and do something a little bit different tonight. I just want to share with you, to end it, a little bit of the biographical background of the Malbim. It's hard to imagine a scholar of his stature who had a more tortured life. I think he was thrown out, all told, he was thrown out of the rabbinate in 6 different cities. And it was invariably because he was very principled. You know, you would think a person with such a, and I don't mean this in a negative way, such an obviously pedantic turn of personality, right? Things have to be just so. This does not sound like certainly not an intellectually compromising individual, right? It's this way. I have proofs. You can prove me wrong. Fine. In the fair marketplace of ideas, if you can disprove my theory on words, I'm fine with that. But until you do, it's this way. It's not other way. There's no fuzziness. There's precision, right? I just want to end with one funny story. One of the towns where he got kicked out of the rabbinate. This is in Bucharest, the capital of Romania. Okay? One of the leaders of the reform in that town sent him a shalach manos on Purim. And in the shalach manos was composed of pork and lobster. That was the shalach manos. You need two minim, you need two separate things for shalach manos. So he sent them pork and he sent them lobster. Okay, within an hour, I don't know what they had in those days, photography or tintypes or cameos. There was some kind of an image. I don't have, my other handouts, I had the picture of Sham Shmuel Hirsch, and then I couldn't find a picture of the Malbim, okay? But he had a picture. He had some kind of a self-portrait. He sends the guy back 2 images, 2 different portraits, maybe a frontal view and a profile of himself with a little note attached. Thank you so much for your gracious shalach manos. As you saw fit to send an image of yourself, I saw fit to return the favor. Okay, so he was pretty scrappy. That's my class for tonight. In Yitz Hashem, next Tuesday night, I don't have a title yet, but we're going to be doing a passage from Rabbi Tzadok of Lublin. It's the second time. He's one of my favorite authors, and he is from the 19th century, or that's when he wrote most of his works. So it'll be Rabbi Tzadok of Lublin at 8 o'clock next Tuesday night. There is a collation in the next room for those who are interested.